Good morning. For those who don't know me, my name is Fabrizio Carmignani. I'm a professor of economics with the Griffith Business School. And this morning for me it's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Paul Ferraro, our distinguished speaker for this keynote address. Now, Paul is currently Bloomberg Distinguished Professor at Johns Hopkins University, and his research agenda is extremely interesting and covers a number of topics, including the design and empirical evaluation of environmental policies and the institutions that are required to implement these policies, the integration of biophysical and economic information in spatial modeling for environmental decision-making, but also social norm-based policies and the relationship between children, non-cognitive attributes, and educational outcomes. So it's an extremely interesting and, as I said, wide range of interests. And he has had a successful a number of successful achievements and results, but I would like just to remember a few of the highlights. In 2011, he was awarded the Costshare Prize for Outstanding Article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. In 2011 and 12, he was a Fulbright Scholar. And he has published in a variety of outlets, including top economic journals like the American Economic Review Papers and Proceedings, the Review of Economics and Statistics, Land Economics, but also in science as an indication of the variety of his interests. Today, Paul is going to talk about applying behavioral economics to improve public programs, knowns and unknowns. And this is a review, an overview of his experience and what he has learned throughout his research program in the last few years. So without any further ado, I would like to welcome Professor Ferraro, who, by the way, is now a great rugby fan after the great game of yesterday. So please join me in welcoming Professor Ferraro.
Thank you. Is this on? Can you hear me? Good. Yeah, congratulations to the Maroon fans. My condolences to the Blues. I had a fabulous time watching this at a bar in Gray Street last night. I had no idea why they were doing what they were doing. It took me a while to get the rules. And I found that I've been here since Saturday. I was giving a short course to some natural and physical scientists about causal inference at the University of Queensland earlier in the week. I have no problem with communicating with Australians, but about 2 hours into the game, or hour and a half into the game, everybody began speaking a language I could not follow anymore. The words became short, there was slang words that I could not follow and became unintelligible by the end of the evening, but it was a fabulous, great time. This is a great city, and I'm really happy to have had the opportunity to come here and talk to you today about behavioral economics. So when I say behavioral economics, I just want to make sure we're clear. I'm talking about blending in insights from psychology, neuroeconomics, sociology into more traditional economic thought. And this has been going on for decades, right? Since at least the 50s, we've been talking about bounded rationality, and people have been talking about these deviations from the standard model for decades. So it's not something terribly new, but if you look, I've got to put my presentation on. I forgot my instructions. If you look just in the last 3 months at the American Economic Review, you can see that we're now in a time period where behavioral economics is mainstream. There's over 24 articles, I count. There's a bunch of the titles there out there. And some people have even claimed that behavioral economics shouldn't even be a subfield anymore. It is economics now. And Australia has picked up the fever. I know you had a conference last year. I actually wanted to attend it but couldn't pull it off on behavioral insights related to policy and economics. Government units are creating internal units to try to apply behavioral economics to improve the effectiveness of programs and policies, including New South Wales here and Australia. Private companies are engaged in this work as well. There was a quote in a podcast I heard from a Facebook trust engineer, as they're called, who said that at any given moment, a Facebook user is in 10 randomized controlled trials, most of them behaviorally based. And the news has picked it up. At least, I looked in Google and the news, at least 1 or 2 articles every single month in top media outlets related to behavioral economics. And most of my presentation is going to be sort of trying to scratch the surface and see if behavioral economics is really ready for prime time in terms of helping public programs. But I want to make sure everybody's clear that I do believe that it does have some promise. But let's make sure we are on the same page in terms of what I'm talking about, in terms of the insights from behavioral economics. So someone came up with this great memory device, Mindscape, to kind of characterize a bunch of the attributes or insights from behavioral economics that people care about where the information is coming from, not just the content of the information. Incentives are still there. Behavioral economists have not thrown out traditional focus on incentives, but now they're shaped by mental shortcuts and strange preferences, probability weighting and loss aversion. That we influence by norms. We look to others to figure out what's the right thing to do, not just because of lack of information, but because we want to conform to what others are doing in our peer group. Defaults matter. We have incoherent preferences and are influenced by subtle changes in the choice environment. Priming, affect, or emotional. We want to look good to others. Some of these are not dramatically different from what people had already talked about in the past, and some of them are. Right? In the jargon of economics, we're boundedly rational. We have incoherent preferences. We're probability weighters. We're loss averse. We're time inconsistent, dynamically inconsistent. We're other regarding. And I put some up there because some of the more recent research is being much more careful. Instead of just looking at averages, is trying to do these mixture models and try to classify different behavioral types. But there's reasonably good evidence that some of these might be true. But as we're going to talk about, there's a lot of people think that all this has been firmly established, and there's actually quite a lot of blowback. But if it were true, if those things were true about how humans behave, there's a lot of implications for how we design public policy and programs. So that when we give information, the timing matters, incentives, the timing might matter, the framing might matter, simplifying the decision environment might be important, how we set the defaults are important, we're encouraging people to do goal setting and engage in commitment devices. There's all this range of other attributes of policies and programs that economists traditionally may not have been thinking was important for the final outcomes. And again, so a lot of my presentation is focusing on some weaknesses or some unknowns, but I wanted to just make clear that for those of you who are big fans of behavioral economics and the policy range, I think it's worthwhile enough that I agreed to become a co-director of this center funded by the U.S. Department of Agriculture to work with program administrators to create insights or to apply insights from behavioral economics into program designs and run agro-environmental. These are agricultural programs designed to affect the environment in terms of public goods as randomized controlled trials. So I believe in enough to spend the last 6 months doing a huge number of meetings with federal program administrators with so far not much to show for it. All right, so just to give you some preview of the sorts of things I'm worried about. So this is a very famous figure or a story about the effect of defaults. Right, so you've got similar countries culturally, geographically, Austria and Germany, Denmark and Sweden. And this is the effect of consent. People have consented to be organ donors in those countries. And you see dramatic differences. Even though culturally and geographically there isn't a big difference between Austria and Germany and Sweden and Denmark, we see dramatic differences in their consent percentages, and people say it's because of defaults. All right, now, if you've actually looked carefully at what's required in Sweden and Austria to opt out, it's not just, it was presented as if it's just filling out a paper. In one country, you're opting in, you have to fill out a piece of paper. Other country, you want to opt out, you fill out the same piece of paper, right? So we shouldn't see that dramatic. But in those countries where it's opt out, it's actually a serious hassle. There are serious costs involved in trying to opt out of that program. And so a more skeptical person of behavioral economics would say, that's just regular economics. There's large costs to opting out, and lots of people decide it's not worth the costs. And the other problem with a lot of the results that are coming out of the behavioral economics and the rush to apply these to policy is when you scratch the surface, people realize that people are actually not looking at the final outcomes that we care about in a lot of these studies. And this is a classic one. I just went on Wikipedia to see the actual donation rates in those countries that I contrasted there. And they're not dramatically different. So the fact that people are effectively consenting is not really relevant. What's relevant are they actually giving up their organs at the end of life? And there's really not much of a difference despite the huge difference in the effective consent rate. Another area, I don't know if this is a big deal in Australia, but the United States, we're crazy about our school lunchrooms. We've got to get these school lunch, kids eating broccoli, Brussels sprouts, what is going on, get them away from the chocolate milk. The U.S. Department of Agriculture set up a center at Cornell. David Just, the colleague that's helping with our center, the other center on agro-environmental policy. He's co-director, and on their website they've got all these things that they've discovered from empirical research that matter in terms of food choices. And a very well-known one in the United States is all you got to do is put the good food, the healthy food, up front where it's more accessible. Don't put it in the back or the end of the line. And there's research apparently showing that students, if they see it up front, they go, oh, I'll take it, but if it's at the end of the line, they're not going to take it. And the problem with a lot of this work, like a lot of the work that I'm going to be talking about later in the presentation, there's not a lot of work showing these effects that people find are persistent. And for a lot of the behaviors we're trying to affect, persistence is a really important part. It doesn't matter if I can get them to eat broccoli for a few weeks. What I really need to do is have them eating broccoli for a long period of time. There was a recent systematic review of lunchroom behavioral interventions, and they quoted one study that showed a sustained impact. All the other studies were short-term. One study showed a sustained impact, and by sustained they meant 2 months. So you might be skeptical, and I've got this interview of Sam, age 12, who talked about a lunchroom change where they put the more desirable food up front. Let's see if we can hear.
They did that at my school, and the first day it worked, and all the kids went for the stuff that was good for us at the beginning of the lunch line. But then we realized that the stuff that we wanted was at the end of the lunch line, and so the second day, everybody went for the stuff that we wanted.
And so apparently, although lots of research shows adults can't do backward inductions, students can at the age of 12. They must lose the capability to do it later on in their lives. All right, so the knowns, the title is knowns and unknowns. The knowns I'm going to go over pretty quickly and move into the unknowns, which I think is more interesting for scholarship and the applications in the policy context. So I do believe there's a credible and growing evidence base that interventions inspired by behavioral economics can change policy-relevant behaviors. I don't think it's a complete sham. And for a lot of these things people are talking about, it's really inexpensive to implement, which implies that even if their behavioral impacts are small, which is often a criticism, you're getting a 5 percentage point change, an 8 percentage point change, but they're almost costless in the amount of context, or pennies, and therefore they're very cost effective to do. It would be silly just to leave them on the shelf. And importantly, often no new legislation or rules are needed. One of the criticisms of a lot of things that we do in economics from policy side is that's a great idea, but there's no way in hell we'd be able to get that past the legislature or past the citizens. It would just be too hard given the rules that exist and the ideologies to get that forward. Whereas a lot of these behavioral interventions that have been proposed, program administrators already have the authority and the scope to implement them. They can go immediately if they were convinced that the evidence base was there. And the other nice feature is a lot of these are easy to pilot in inexpensive randomized controlled trials, or relatively inexpensive randomized controlled trials, which makes it easier to evaluate the effectiveness and build up an evidence base for them. All right, so let's get to some of the unknowns. All right, one of the big unknowns is the same unknown that we have throughout the experimental sciences and social psychology and science more generally, is the replication crisis. A lot of these results in behavioral economics in the policy domain are one-off experiments published in high-profile journals. There's not a lot of replications, and generally people have found with replication the truth wears off. That generally they find the treatment effects tend to get smaller over time, if not disappear completely. And that's a big problem that you see a lot, I see a lot in the policy realm, because I work as an advisor to a variety of different policy institutions internationally and domestically, is people see a single study and they rush to want to scale it up rather than attempt to replicate in a different context and see if they get that same result. The other thing is, for lots of these interventions, the mechanisms are poorly understood. How exactly does this work? And that's a problem, again, when we don't have replications, we have a single statistically significant effect in a single study, that a lot of the supposed mechanisms that are driving this, probability weighting with a particular probability weighting function, present biasness, dynamic inconsistency, they're still being fought over by scholars who are working in those fields. Whether in recent papers on dynamic inconsistency, for example, are not finding very much of it, and they're arguing that all that previous work over several decades showing that people on average are present biased, or up to 1/5 of people are present biased, is an artifact of the experimental designs that we're using to elicit those preferences. So I don't want to wade into that debate. I'm just arguing that a lot of times we assume, oh, it's loss aversion. I'm going to create a loss aversion contract. Loss aversion is highly prevalent throughout the population, and we're going to do this particular contract. And it's not clear that that loss aversion really has been nailed down as a feature of decision-making environments. And it's important to know the mechanisms because we care about welfare analysis. Very few of these behavioral interventions have been subject to welfare analyses. Are people better off as a result of it? Usually we assume they are. They're saving more. They're getting more immunizations. Kids are going to school. People are conserving electricity and water and recycling more. These are all good things. But it may not necessarily be that way, particularly if it's working through mechanisms that may reduce utility rather than enhance it. And so there's very little that's been done in that domain. Like I said before, persistence is poorly understood. I've seen very few articles that go beyond 6 months and almost none that go beyond a year. Those are really rare. A tiny proportion of the behavioral studies out there, particularly the experiments with the more higher internal validity, have looked beyond a year. And most of the evidence is coming from consumers in decision environments that they have infrequent familiarity with the good, like retirement decisions or immunization decisions. And that doesn't mean that the evidence from those domains is wrong, but to extrapolate to domains where we have a lot of experience in that domain, or to extrapolate to the profit maximization realm where producers are, may be an enormous leap, and we don't have much evidence from those contexts. All right, a few more unknowns. I'm going to give exact examples of most of these as we go through. A few studies contrast the traditional economics interventions, the unbounded rationality assumed intervention with the behavioral economics inspired one. Generally, they'll say, oh, the traditional didn't work in this other context, and I have in this context, I'm going to use behavioral, and it worked. But they don't actually compare the traditional sort of price-based approach, a pecuniary-based approach, or whatever the approach might be, a mechanism for coming out of mechanism design literature, to the behavioral and a horse race in the same exact context. Those are really rare, those studies. Few studies see what happens when you mix behavioral interventions. There's such a plethora of interventions now being done, they're eventually going to be mixed in the same context. Do they complement each other? Do they work antagonistically? We don't have much idea. If I start putting loss aversion contracts in with social comparisons, in with default changes, is that all just going to add up cumulatively, or is there going to be some interference among those? All right, and few mix, for example, price in moral suasion, price in changes in goal setting or things like that, and we're not exactly sure. From a particular example I have from the Southeast United States, there's a social comparison followed by a price. And people became furious about the price in ways that they may not have otherwise because they'd already reacted to social norms. They were already behaving in the way that the policymaker said was desirable on average, and then the policymaker decided to add more, a price increase, and that had a big political problem, if not a behavioral issue, which we don't know. And the other issue is, as more and more of these get used, right, these interventions and more media, people are going to know, oh, you're telling me how other people behave because you want me to behave that way. Oh, you're setting the default over here rather than over here because you want me to save more or do something like that. And it's not clear how people are going to react.
Themselves and vice versa. It was a tiny effect, but the results weren't really the story. The real story was that Facebook was messing with us.
Gives you pause and scares me when you think that they were just doing an experiment to manipulate how people were feeling and how they then reacted on Facebook.
People went apoplectic.
It has this big brother element to it that I think people are going to be very uncomfortable with.
So I don't know if you saw this. This is when Facebook, in collaboration with some scholars, was manipulating news feeds to see how that affected people's emotions and therefore their behavior online. Very valid scientific question. People got, at least for a few days, really pissed off about that. All right, so, and I work, for example, with politicians and program administrators in the US. It's one of their biggest concerns. What happens when people find out this is why we changed the program, because we're trying to manipulate them? All right, so they're worried about the political blowback, the optics, as they often call it. But I'm worried as a scholar about how that might affect behavior once people are aware of exactly why the choice architecture or decision environment has been changed in the way it has been. All right, so let's do a concrete example of a behavioral intervention and talk about some of these issues. So I'm going to talk about something that I'm more familiar with, and this is social comparisons, used in the behavioral literature. People have been talking about this since the 1950s, but it's really taken off in the 1990s with some social psychologists pushing this in the policy realm, this idea that their idea from psychology is that people care about what others are doing. And now economists who work with asymmetric information have always recognized that I might get information from others' behaviors about what's optimal for me, but psychologists say, no, it's about norms. That people want to know what is the norm in a particular community, and they want to conform to that norm. So if you can use language or intervention to establish what the norm is, then you might be able to affect their behavior in the way that you want them to behave. Pay their taxes, recycle, don't let out so much greenhouse gas emissions, something like that. So this is an experiment done by the Behavioural Insights team in the UK. You may have seen this, where they wanted to get people who were delinquent on their taxes to pay up. And they sent them reminder messages. So they sent the control group just a reminder message that you owe money, please pay up. And then others got this message that said 9 out of 10 people in your country, postcode, or town pay their tax on time. And they found that there was a treatment effect, small but policy relevant treatment effect. Right? And they argue it's because of the establishing of the norm. So one aspect of this particular experiment that I'm not going to, it's another problem in behavioral economics and experiments, is they actually did approximately 35 treatment arms, but the ones that they reported were the ones that were statistically significant. And they're not Bayesian, so I'd be a little concerned that that's often what we're getting, especially with the policy realm, when they have huge pools and lots of questions. Scholars are jumping in thinking we can do all these great experiments, all these treatment arms, and tends to be experimentalists are not the best statisticians, and sometimes I'm worried about some of the things that are getting published. We do a lot of things like just looking at p-values. If one intervention has a small p-value, another one has a large, we say one's effective, one's ineffective. And I've seen things in AER where they don't actually compare the interventions themselves. They're just looking at the standard errors individually. But that's another thing. So social comparisons, I was skeptical when I saw some of the literature about these, because I didn't think the designs were very good. In 2007, in the southeastern United States, we were hammered with a drought, and there was a push to try to do demand reduction for water use. And they didn't want to use price. So the idea was we're going to do an information campaign, and we're going to educate people. And so one of the big utilities agreed to run it as a randomized controlled trial, where some households were going to get no information, some were going to get information on what practices they could do, but no reason why. Just the information, that's why they're not conserving, they need more information. They got information augmented with moral suasion, please do the right thing, so all the usual civic duty language, every drop counts, we all got to do our part to contribute to solving Atlanta's problems. And then the third one was that augmented with a social comparison, which I'll show you in a minute what that actually looks like. So there's about 12,000 households in each treatment group and about 71,000 in the control group. Right? So about 12,000 households got just this tip sheet, right? There's already stuff in the ambient. Everybody knows that there's a drought, right? So they get this tip sheet in case you didn't know that you could turn off your faucet while you're brushing your teeth, or that you could take shorter showers, or you could look for leaks your property, or that you're overwatering your lawn. All right, so traditional economic theory would say everybody knows these already. This treatment is not going to have much of an impact. The second augmented that with moral suasion, which is a very typical approach in non-governmental organizations and governmental organizations, where you got a personalized letter, dear Mr. Ferraro, we got a problem, you're part of the problem, please do your part to contribute to being part of the solution. And they use all these cute words like don't waste water, every drop counts, that sort of thing. And then the third group got all that plus. You might be interested to know that your total consumption last year was, this is just an example, 52,000 gallons, right? So about 4 liters to a gallon. And that's information that's already on the bill. It's not new. But what's new is this next thing. It says your neighbor's average, it's really the median, but nobody understood in the focus groups what median was, so the word average was used. And we actually had apparently in our subject pool was a statistician from Emory University who called up to tell me that average is not the same as median, and I needed to correct those sheets out there. So anyway, they got the median, which was truthful, and then it gave them their percentile, framed as social psychologists would argue you ought to in this particular negative framing. So no matter, even if you were at the 25th percentile, it says you use more water than 25% of your Cobb County neighbors. All right, and why would you even do all three of this? This is another problem in behavioral economics where people throw actually a whole bunch of things at people, but argue what's driving it is that behavioral economics inspired part of it. So this is a very famous paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association where they wanted to get people to reduce their weights. And they said, we're going to have monthly weigh-ins, and then for 2 other treatment arms, we're going to do behavioral economics inspired treatments, where we're going to have this lottery system where you get put in a lottery if you meet your weight reduction goals, and you might win a financial prize, and that if you don't meet your weight reduction goals, they still put you in the lottery, and they tell you how much you would have won had you actually met your weight goal. So they're basically arguing it's regret aversion. That's what they're harnessing. And this other one, they put a bunch of money in an account for you, and you can even put more in, and then it's locked up. And if you don't meet your weight goals, you'll lose it, right? So they're harnessing loss aversion, apparently there. But the problem is, in both those, you're paying people to reduce their weight loss. And you're comparing to a control with no payment, but you're saying it's the regret aversion and it's the loss aversion that's operating here. And they find that people reduce, I think it's a short-term study, it was 16 weeks, I think it was, I think it says, 16 weeks. There was a treatment effect. Papers went wild with this in terms of saying that you could pay people, you get weight loss reduction, and that it was behavioral economics. We weren't able to do this before, but now that we understand regret aversion and loss aversion, we can get people to finally lose weight. And what I was really surprised, I went and read the article, and it was really clear in a section called Conclusions that after 7 months, they went back and there was no difference between the folks and the people. Now, their argument was, well, that's because we got to keep paying. If we kept paying them forever, then they would retain that weight. And that's perhaps possible, but I'm not exactly sure that's a great strategy long-term for weight loss. All right, so back to the Georgia Drought social comparisons, right? So compared to the control group, the treatment group reduced their water use for very little. I'm not putting the standard errors up there, but it's not statistically different from 0. The treatment 2, just the moral suasion, actually did reduce water use by almost 3%, statistically different from 0, different from the other treatments. Did a test of trend, those are different. And interestingly, for the utility, they said if we could get anything over 2%, that would be awesome. That would be great. It's a single letter, that's all it is 1 letter. And then the treatment 3 with the social comparison got an even higher, larger treatment effect, all right? So that's interesting. So that's a 3-month period, 4-month period after the letter was sent. But the bigger question is there a persistent effect, or does it go away? All right, so this is actually the same folks, or the same homes over time, all the way up to December 2013. Treatment 2, which had an effect, actually waned just in a couple of months. And that's something that people found in a lot of cases, that with moral suasion, you can get a short-term effect, but it rarely lasts for very long. But interestingly, the social comparison treatment, although it waned a bit, sort of stabilized. Now it goes down smaller towards the final years, but if you believe that when people move out of the home, they're doing it at random, that our letter couldn't possibly affect whether you move or not, so attrition is at random, and you only want to look at the average treatment effect on the treated, those who stay in the home, even all the way up to 2013, there's still almost a policy-relevant treatment effect years later. In terms of cost effectiveness, because it costs less than $1 to treat people, huge cost effectiveness compared to anything else the utility normally would do. All right, so there seems to be evidence there of a persistent effect, a policy-relevant effect, but there's not a lot of data in other social comparisons for persistence, or what happens when you repeatedly expose people to that social comparison. Now, O-power, I don't know if people are familiar with this, I don't know if you have a version of that here in the energy domain, where you get information about how your energy use compares to others, and you get encouraged to reduce your energy use, and you get a bunch of tips on how to do that, and you get subsidies and rebates and things like that. This is one of those examples where a lot has been made of the social comparison success of O-power's group, but they throw a lot in here, right? So it's not just the social comparison, this treatment, there's a bunch of other things in there. But by and large, they find treatment effects. And the nice thing about this particular experiment, it's been run in right now, I think, 29 different cities in the United States, and generally finding treatment effects of 1% to 2% for every month that somebody's getting this message. I don't know if people have seen this paper by Alcott and Rogers in the American Economic Review, where they got a hold of data for, I think, 17 of the cities that did something very interesting. Not only did they persistently give people messages and maintained a control group during all that time, but they had a group that at random, they stopped giving them the messages to see with this big question, what happens when we stop the intervention? So these kinds of studies are really rare in behavioral economics, by and large, much less in the policy domain. And so what you can see, so what you're seeing is the difference between treatment group and the control group. So the treatment starts around just after July 2008. You see a big reduction in energy use as a result of getting these messages. No difference between the drop group and the continue group. And then just after July 2010, the blue group, they stopped getting those messages. And what you start to see is they start to float up a bit. But you still see some persistence. How long would that last? It's not clear because they only run it out to July 2012. Some colleagues and I have gone back and looked longer, and we see actual persistence even after the people move out of the home, suggesting that people have actually put capital, energy-efficient capital into the home somehow that remains even after the people themselves who were treated leave. But these sorts of studies that look at the persistence over some reasonable period of time and look at this question of what happens when the intervention stops are incredibly rare. In fact, I don't know of any other studies like this, but I didn't do an exhaustive search to try to find some. All right. So if you believe that social comparisons can change behavior, and I'm starting to become a believer in that, I think there's enough replications to do this. The big question is, well, how? Like through what mechanisms? A lot of economists would just look at that and say, I can't really see my water use. I don't really have a sense of, what would be optimal. But if I had information about what other people are doing, I might be able to better maximize my utility function. So it's purely just imperfect information. So yeah, they're boundedly rational, but it's not social norms. It's not other regarding behavior. I'm not looking to other people and saying, oh, I'm using more water than everybody else. I feel terrible about that, or I want to change my behavior. And it matters what the mechanisms are. If it's purely information to help somebody maximize utility, the welfare benefits of that might be very positive. But if I'm shaming people or guilting people into doing it so that I'm actually reducing their utility, then it may not be welfare enhancing. You have to trade off the reduction in the externalities associated with excessive use of the common pool resource with the welfare implications for the household. Right? And then if you're interested in health impacts or environmental impacts or any other thing related to some public good, then you actually care about the mechanism because that may affect exactly how it affects the outcome. In the water context, in the United States, in this area, people are using surface water. And if people change their toilet and their shower behavior, most of that water is going back into the system. So that's not really having much of an effect on the downstream communities that this was intended to help. Whereas if they stop watering their lawns, or that water is sort of lost to the system, at least for a policy-relevant time period, then that actually might have a large effect on the goals they're doing. And just to make program is more effective, we need to know what the mechanisms are. And the mechanisms are typically assumed. In almost all the papers I've seen, they are assumed. They're not tested in any particular way to verify those are the mechanisms. And they're generally competing rival explanations for the mechanisms in most contexts. All right, so I'll just give a punchline in case you're curious. In our particular context, we try to get at the mechanisms in that particular context, a variety of indirect tests based on theory and using a lot of other data we were able to get on the households and the context, that all the data seem to point in that it's something about social norms or other regarding preferences. It's not just the pure information for utility maximizing agents. But we still don't know the welfare implications. Is it a desirable thing or not? The utility finds it cost effective, but that's not the same as welfare implications. And the welfare stuff really matters. Right? So here's a famous experiment from QJE, not really an experiment, but pretty reasonable observational data that show that when you change the default, whether people are auto-enrolled into the retirement program or not auto-enrolled, you get dramatic differences in enrollment in participation in the retirement plan. Right? And the big picture, the big punchline here is that young people particularly are not enrolling in retirement at rates that we, the outsiders, think they ought to be. We've decided they're doing suboptimal savings, and we're going to change the choice architecture from opt-in to opt-out, and then we get about 80% of everybody participates in the enrollment, and they've actually done a small number of studies. They've looked at 6 months, 12 months, 18 months later, and find out that it drops off a little bit, but still substantially higher. And the assumption is that's great. That's good for these 24-year-olds, often that are in the 0 to 6 range, who ordinarily wouldn't be saving. They'd be at around 20%. We've boosted them up to 80%. Maybe that's good, but maybe that's not very good. Nobody's looked at the welfare implications of that. And to do that, it's going to take some structural modeling, and you have to have theorists involved, and it's a lot more work. Right? Or an alternative is, if you believe in revealed preferences, you can give people choices across. Do you want to be in the auto-enrollment or not? Or in this particular case, there's a series of recent papers showing that if you frame employment contracts with a loss framing, you basically give people money and take it away from them for non-performance rather than give them the same equivalent amount for performance, people exert more effort. Right? So a variety of papers have shown that. They claim it's loss aversion. I don't want to debate whether that is, but the question is that good for the people or not? Right? And so one thing they did in this particular working paper is that they gave people a chance to bid on those contracts. And they found that the willingness to pay for the loss-averse contracts was higher. Right? So if you believe in revealed preferences, people want that contract. They want to be somehow forced or induced to give extra effort. And the authors interpret it as some kind of commitment device. Right? So everybody's bringing all these behavioral theories in there. That explains it. They have some kind of dynamic inconsistency. They can't stay with their plan, but the loss aversion contract sort of forces them to do so. And an alternative is that people don't recognize what's going on, that it's suboptimal. Right? If you're already in the behavioral economics world, you've got to sort of be able to handle all the possibilities, and it's possible that they're just choosing the wrong contract, right? But that is one way to get at welfare, is simply by revealed preferences in the context where people can have a choice, if you're assuming that once they see what's going on, they can make the right choice. All right, so moving on to other unknowns. What about producers, or agents that are characterized more like profit maximizers in competitive environments, or have good knowledge of the good, right? So there's been a variety of studies showing that a lot of these behavioral anomalies go away when you have experts who know the decision environment, engage in it, or when they're in a competitive environment where these money pumps created that basically force you, the invisible hand pushes you toward rationality, even though you might have some behavioral anomaly. All right, so I want to focus on the particular intervention of defaults that we talked about before, because these have a fairly good evidence base for them. All right, so the defaults basically that people are more likely to choose the default irrespective of its characteristics and if the same option had been actively chosen. If you tell people you can save anything between 0 or 6% of your salary, we're going to start you at 3 and you can move it, most people say, I'll take 3. But if you moved it to 6 for the same people, they'll say, I'll take 6. I'll save 6, right? So that's like one of the famous examples that people have incoherent preferences. There's a QJE article arguing this, and that you just change their starting point, give them random numbers to start, that will influence their choice. All right, and the idea is that people say that defaults are good in the policy domain because they preserve choice, right? You could still do between 0 and 6. We just start you at 6, and then you've got to move off of that point. There's still voluntary choice. All right, so lots of mechanisms have been proposed for how this actually works, how do defaults operate, power of suggestion, time inconsistency, cost of information acquisition, loss aversion. I don't think there's any great evidence. There is some good neuroeconomics or neuroscience evidence, and again, if you believe the way they actually do the data mining, that when people are not very familiar with the good, that's where the default seems to matter most. Right, so the big question is, defaults matter for people that are familiar with the good or are less consumers and more producers, profit maximizing. I just would point out as we go along, there is one group where there's pretty good experimental evidence that they're not influenced by defaults. That's economists. So there was an experiment done for the European Association of Environmental and Resource Economists where you could do, when you registered online, you could do a carbon offset for your travel. And they had some that were opt-in and some that were opt-out. I think they had an active choice one too, where you had to make a choice, but there was no default. But you had to make some choice. And they found no significant effects of the default. So, it's not clear why that is. Are we just too clever? Or are we experienced with the good? And this is a big issue that's argued about defaults, that it's just really a transaction cost story. It's not a behavioral psychology, loss aversion sort of story. It's just transaction costs. That a lot of these defaults where they operate have fairly substantial transaction costs. And in this particular context, they were 0. It's a radio click. You're just right there. It's barely any cost at all, so they're not going to affect people. All right, but I wanted to get into a situation where it was a competitive environment, people that plausibly are closer to profit maximizers than we've looked at before when we're talking about students or workers making retirement decisions, and they're familiar with the good. But the problem is if you go to firms right away, then you've got this added confounder that they're making collective decisions. They've got bureaucratic decision structures. You're not even sure maybe who's making the decision. So we didn't want to go immediately to firms, although we're doing that now. But we wanted something that was like that. So we said sole proprietorship would be a good way to go. And we had an opportunity to do this with farmers in the United States. We wanted them in a competitive decision environment, so there was an opportunity to do this within an auction. And we wanted them to have a familiar good and decision environment, so we chose these conservation auctions that are big in the United States, where farmers bid on contracts to change practices on their land in ways that will generate positive externalities for communities around them. So we took 2 areas where pollution is a big problem in the Texas Gulf and the Chesapeake Bay, and we recruited farmers. We had 371 who were going to bid, who were interested in bidding on nutrient management contracts. Right? This was an opportunity for them to change practices on their land. So here's an example. Phosphorus tank and trench fillers. You put this into the ground, it collects the rainwater, and it takes out the phosphorus, which is a major pollutant in the waters in the United States. And there's some private benefits to these as well as public benefits. So it's an impure public good, but they're fairly expensive. These particular ones, tanks and trench, are $10,000, $11,000 US dollars, $17,000 US dollars. People generally do not do these, farmers do not do these as a private decision. All right, but they may do it in a subsidized decision. So they were in an auction environment where they could bid what's called a cost share. We do that a lot in the United States in the farming context, as we call it cost share, where here's the cost of installing it by a private contractor, and the US government's going to pay 50% of the cost, or they're going to pay 80% or 10%. Usually it's a fixed take or leave it, but sometimes there's auctions for that. And that's what we set up here, is an auction for it. So this is a real auction. There's a conservation organization that was involved in this, providing the money to do this. And so landowners would say that I'll pay 50% of the cost for putting in a phosphorus trench. And they're bidding against other farmers and at multi-unit first price discriminative procurement auctions. And those with the highest cost share, meaning they'll pay most of it. The farmer, they're going to be accepted until the available budget was exhausted. And all bids for all contracts are pooled in one auction, and farmers are aware of the rules. So the strategic environment is very unusual. All right, so the theory is quite complex, but that's not what I want to focus on today. I want to focus on the experimental treatment. And it was really simple. It was an online auction. For the contracts that they want to bid on, there was a slider. And they just bid something between 0 and 100%. Half of the farmers randomly saw 100%, half of the farmers saw 0% as the starting point. And then they would slide it. So if you had 100, you had to slide it down to what you wanted. And if it started 0, you had to slide it up. Pretty minor difference in the decision environment. Behavioralists who believe strongly defaults matter would argue that those who start at 100 are going to bid higher than those who start at 0. All right? So the null hypothesis that the expected bids with defaults shouldn't matter. All right? But surprising to me, it apparently did matter. All right? So whether you take the raw numbers or you say, well, those between 0 and 100%, I want to use a fractional logit to deal with the nature of that dependent variable, you get anywhere from 6 to 9 percentage point difference in their bids if you had 100% as your starting default bid versus 0%. Right? And so 8.9% is equivalent to farmers leaving about $1,250 US on the table. So it's not, a few tens of dollars in a laboratory experiment. This is a substantial amount of money, particularly when you think about how much the US gives farmers for these kinds of contracts, about $4.5 billion every single year. Now, this needs replication, needs more work on mechanisms, all the things I've talked about. But it's an interesting example of producers being affected. But here's another one in the same context, US context. There's an auction for another program called the Conservation Reserve Program, and there were expiring acres. They expire every 10 years. And the US Department of Agriculture wanted to get people to re-enroll, and they wanted them to do more practices per dollar spent. So they're actually bidding in multidimensional space with their practices and their bid value. But that's not what I want to focus on. I want to focus on that some of these folks got a reminder letter just telling them that the auction's going on. It's been going on, this auction has been going on since the 80s, right? So everybody knows these people are actually in the program, been in the program for at least 10 years, if not longer. They're familiar with that, but we sent a reminder anyway because we were afraid if we just sent this letter that on the right-hand side is giving all these sort of social comparisons. This is what all your other neighbors in your state are doing, and this is what the best stewards are doing in terms of their environmental benefit index and all the practices they're doing. We want to make sure that we weren't just picking up a reminder effect. And the U.S. Department of Agriculture said they didn't want to do that because they said everybody knows this program's going on. It's saturated in their environment. But we just insisted on having 3 treatment arms. So control group, a reminder letter, just the left-hand side, and then one that augmented it with all this social information on the outside. And we don't find any difference between just the pure reminder effect. It does have an effect, about 2 percentage points more people bidding, but that's the same as we get with the social comparison. So it's not a social comparison, it's just a reminder effect. We can't induce people to do more environmental practices per acre on their farms. And so we get no additional behavioral effect from the social comparison. So there's an example where it didn't work, although they still was cost effective for getting additional offers if the USDA believed that was going to help make the auction more competitive and there are a variety of other ancillary benefits, but no effect. Now, hopefully this will get out into print. This is the other problem we have in behavioral economics and science in general. When you don't have a big treatment effect, nobody wants to publish your paper. Right, so one of the reviewers said, I really liked this paper until I saw they didn't really get a treatment effect. And I don't think that's worthy of being put in a good journal. So, of course, we wrote back on trying to talk about publication bias and the problems associated with that. But that is another issue in behavioral economics. So let me just go right to the end and just talk about one last thing. All right, is that when people know we're being manipulated, right? When people know we're going to be what you're doing. Right, so here's another example of an experiment that was done. They got a lot of media attention that showed when they randomly changed where they put things on the menu, it affected, in a real restaurant, how people ordered. Right? Stuff that was at the top of the menu, at the bottom of the menu, were much more popular than stuff in the middle. And they were just randomly assigning it. And so people just couldn't get through to the middle to actually look at things. They just looked at what was on the end. And so the idea is if you can put the unhealthy stuff in the middle, if that becomes like a rule or a standard, and the healthy stuff at the ends, people are going to eat more healthily. All right, so, but the question is that, if that became a rule, right, that became a law that restaurants had to do based on some kind of criteria, don't you think people would sort of figure that out? They say, oh, all the sweet, fat stuff is in the middle. I need to make it to that. Don't start by reading the ends. It's not clear, but we don't have any evidence of what happens when people know that they're being manipulated, they're being nudged, or you're doing this, you're doing some kind of intervention with the intent of getting them to do a particular behavior. We've got only 2 studies that are about hypothetical choices, which they claim knowing the intent of the intervention didn't seem to change their behavior. But hypothetical studies can give a lot of variance and noise. And then a third one, which told them what we're doing, but then if you didn't like it, you didn't have to participate in the experiment. So the only people actually participating in the experiment are the people who were fine with it, and they find a treatment effect from it. But that's not quite the same thing as saying that for a population, a randomly chosen individual, an expectation is not going to be bothered by knowing the intent of the experiment. So I've just got a few more minutes. So I just wanted to go back to just this issue of horse racing, the traditional interventions versus behavioral. Because one thing that really worries me is that in a lot of contexts, we're not doing this. We're sort of saying, here's a context, and I've got this cool idea of loss aversion context or social comparisons or commitment devices, and we're not testing them against a more traditional intervention. People want to rush to think that somehow the behavioral econ stuff is a magical. And I know very few studies that have done this. This is a recent paper, working paper from Japan. At least that's what the experiment was, where they got a utility who was interested in critical peak pricing, where they raised the price during periods of high demand, to have one group randomly assigned to get the higher price, one group randomly assigned just to be encouraged or exhorted politely, please reduce your demand during this period. We have a high load of demand during this time, and it would be really beneficial if you could reduce your energy use during this time, and then a control group. And what they find is that, so it's deviations from the control group there, and we're going for reductions in energy use. So 0 is no reduction in energy use. And the dotted line is those who were politely requested, the moral suasion, and the red line is those who actually had a price. And you see 2 things. One, you see the price much more effective right off the bat, and the other thing is the moral suasion quickly wanes. This is 7 critical peak pricing during the winter month. They also did it during the summer. They had 5 periods during that time and see the same pattern. Right? So it's interesting in the sense that, yeah, the moral suasion had some effect, but it quickly waned, and it was nowhere near as effective as the traditional price instrument. But again, interpreting this stuff, look carefully at the sample before we make any conclusions. 41,000 people in this utility. That's what you sort of see in the beginning. And I was like, wow, that's a sizable sample. But then when you look closer, to get people to participate in this, so this wasn't a natural field experiment in the sense that people didn't even know they were going to. They asked people to participate in this program, and they offered them advanced meters, in-home display, and a participation bonus of $240. So there's other things in here. And of all 41,000, only 691 were willing to do it. So, thinking about the external validity of what we've got there, you've got to be a little bit more skeptical. Again, not rushing to say this study is that now showed us that we should be going for traditional instruments, not the behavioral stuff. All right. So with that, I wanted to leave 15 minutes for questions, criticisms. I'm happy if there are no questions to go back for a few slides I've missed, but I think I've talked enough. So thanks for your attention, and we'll open it up to questions.
I'm sure that there will be several questions, but I would like to take the opportunity as the chair to ask the first question.
Okay.
In a previous life, I was with the United Nations, and we had what I would call an experiment, even though it wasn't really a scientific experiment. But we had, in a small town, we divided the population in two groups, and we provided some incentive to one of the two groups to behave in a certain way. What we observed was a change in behavior that, however, didn't last long, as you suggested.
Right.
But the interesting thing was that the children started to change behavior. They were not the target of the incentive system, but there was a change in the behavior of the children.
Right.
And surprisingly enough, we observed that this change in behavior lasted for much longer. And then the question was, okay, what's going on? And the explanation that we gave was that the children were interested in knowing what their parents were doing. And the parents explained, look, we are receiving money if we behave in a certain way. And the children asked why. And they said, well, because these people from the United Nations, they think that this behavior is good. And we believe that this message stuck in the mind of the children. So without the need for them to be the actual target of the experiment, the message, the conversation with their parents produced a message that stuck with the children. Now, do you think we were just lucky? Do you think this is something that can be replicated? Do you see that there is any intergenerational sort of transmission mechanism?
So in a lot of fields, this is a huge thing. If you teach the children, then they'll be retained for longer periods of time, right? Don't bother with the adults, they're lost causes. They're not going to take up healthcare, they're not going to do pro-environmental things that you need to reach the children, and you can do it through multiple channels. But I'll tell you, I have not seen good evidence of that. The most folks that are doing the work with children essentially do it where they transmit information, and then sometime later, usually a short period later, they do a test of whether people retained it. And they say the treatment group has more knowledge than the control group, and that's as far as they get along the causal path towards that. So I would say that it's plausible, but I don't really know of any good evidence for that targeting the children or using the parents to communicate to the children is an effective way to get persistent. But that is an implicit hypothesis that drives a huge amount of education work and conservation education, environmental education, health education, is the idea if you target the children early, it will create these habits and norms that will be affecting their behavior persistently over time.
Okay.
It's possible you got lucky, and that's why you remember that anecdote.
Oh, yes, it's stuck in my mind. Okay, thank you very much. So I would like to open for questions. Yes, please.
Can I ask you to think about the time dynamics of response? So when we think of, say, changing water prices for consumption, we generally find lag responses. It takes people to change plants and da-da-da. Yeah. I would imagine we should get the same sort of story with with behavioural stories.
Right. So again, there's not a lot of work that has persistent time data to look at that question. But in the water data, the interesting thing is that the behavioural response, as we have monthly data, is immediate. So if you just look at the month after, you see the full treatment response right away, which again is, if you have, the utility was very interested in that because they said that's the problem with prices, that we can't, one, change them quickly in emergency situations, and two, there's a lagged effect on behavior, particularly because often people are not sure how long that's going to persist, that price. Whereas this behavioral response got an immediate response. And in fact, the utility, they didn't like treatment 3, the social comparison, because they did not want a persistent reduction in demand. They wanted a temporary reduction in demand. And so they liked treatment 2, which got them a reduction, and then it waned by the end of that season. And then they were good to go for the following year. But that's an interesting question when comparing pecuniary and non-pecuniary approaches, is this issue of timing and what's relevant for both policy and in the case of private firms who are doing it for the firm. Hey, John.
This is all basically public sector, private sector has been spending half of GDP.
Right.
This stuff forever.
Right.
I've got a theory, the market parts to teach about, which I know very little.
So that they have a theory of marketing, which is essentially a behavioural, must be a behavioural economics theory. I don't know much about it. What's the interaction between behavioural economics and marketing theory, and what? I mean, there's also at least some welfare stuff, mostly more sceptical, as you're suggesting, about advertising and welfare.
So, I mean, a couple of things in that comparison. So, one, a lot of the marketing is coming from more of the psychology bent. So, every phenomenon gets its own label, right? So everybody tries to generate a label, get your tied to that, whereas an economist would look at a lot of that literature and characterize the same empirical patterns with the same theory. So that's, I think, one big difference, that economists are coming where the marketers people say, we've already know what you're sort of generating, but economists are putting it in a more coherent modeling framework than just labeling each empirical pattern with a new name, catchy name. The other thing is in the marketing, which often comes out of the social psychology, is that this replication thing is finding a lot of things that we apparently thought were true in marketing were not. There's that famous professor from Columbia, I can't remember her name, who did those experiments in supermarkets, which found these incredible behavioral effects of doing small changes in the decision environment. When people actually went back to try to replicate this, it was in the media, nobody could find any of those treatment effects. So I think bringing more rigor on the theory and the replication is going to overturn some of those results. And I think private firms, although they have perhaps more incentives than policymakers to get it right, I think they're also still doing things that steer them in the wrong direction. The big data folks, Facebook and Google, are doing these multi-arm bandit experiments where they're basically endogenously deciding how to change the treatment and control proportions and bring in new treatments. And it's sort of this weird mix of classical and Bayesian statistics, and I've seen a bunch of statisticians criticizing the inferences that are being drawn from the way it's done in practice rather than the way the theorists actually worked it out in the first place. So you can argue that because the firms do this, it must be real, but that may not be quite true. I mean, it's one of those things where I think there's real here, there's tangible things here. I think, probability weighting is a real phenomenon. The question is the nature of it, what proportion of the population is doing it, and to what degree are still open questions, and designing policy based on what we know now is fraught with some difficulties, I think.
In terms of persistence, are there any systematic differences between experiments where, like this John mentioned, you make an investment, you change the plants that you have in your garden, or in electricity, light bulbs, right? I mean, this is back in 2001 in Brazil, they got 20% reduction in consumption. And mostly was
changing technology.
Yeah, change of technology. Where other experiments like menu, in restaurants and so on. So at the end, my intuition is that you would expect longer lasting effects in the first group, and the second one really is honestly, I don't even know why people worry about that. It's like short-term, really.
I mean, that's another thing I didn't mention just because of time, but understanding the mechanism is important for persistence for that very reason. In a lot of cases, if it's a one-time change to capital, that's all I need to do. I need to just get you to make that investment, and then we're done. You're on a new trajectory. You don't have to keep thinking about it or being continually fooled by it. That might be a lot more likely to lead to persistent effects. So interestingly, in that social comparison, the water, that when people move out, the effect is gone. So, and we've done some surveys trying to figure out what the possible capital change is, but it seems to be purely behavioral in the outdoor watering. People have a new habit for how they water, and when they leave the home, that knowledge goes with them. Whereas in the electricity case, we did the same thing where we can look at homes where the movers have gone, control versus treatment, and we see that part of that effect is still persistent over time. About 20%, 25% of the effect that they're seeing from those messages stays even after the people leave, suggesting a capital investment that stays with the home stock rather than the human capital and leaving the home. But I think that's really important. I mean, the retirement is a classic example. The few studies that have looked at persistence have found it because it's one of those things where people don't have to go back and make one-time decision. If you can get them to do it, you're done. Whereas the eating, for example, that's going to be repeated every single day, multiple times a day. You've got to be steering this person toward a particular choice.
In relation to cultural background, do you control for cultural background? Would it make a difference? For example, some people might be more amenable to be told what to do, or social norms, family norms might be different.
Right, so I mean, and thinking about external validity perhaps for that context. So in the particular water experiment, this is a problem. I mean, looking at heterogeneity or conditional treatment responses, when you don't randomize within the subgroups is tricky business for inference. We get a lot of sort of research showing there's heterogeneity that in the medical field, that when they do randomized controlled trials, they don't find that heterogeneity. And a famous example in econ, Matt Kahn's is a friend, so I don't mind criticizing the paper they had where they show that conservatives in the United States don't react as strongly to these messages, these social comparison messages, as liberals. And the first version of the paper actually said they increased their energy use, where they got it, they said, I'm turning on all the lights. But it turned out that was because they misspecified their panel data model. Once they got it specified right, it went away. But really what they found was that conservatives who were not part of a particular group, who had voted in a particular way, it was about 5 different attributes in terms of interaction terms, then they found the difference. And so you have to be sort of careful with that. But looking for heterogeneity is a relevant thing. We looked at it in terms of our water experiment using voting records from the United States to look at partisanship and whether or not there was a response of conservative Republican Americans versus Democrats who were strong partisans, and we didn't see any difference in their response to that. So that's one dimension of cultural ideology. And in the United States, there's a huge cultural divide in surveys on the environment between conservatives and liberals, but in this particular context, they all equally responded to the message, at least in a statistical sense. I think it's important.
We have time for one last question.
Thank you so much. I'm actually currently conducting an experiment, and I'm starting to find some challenges and looking for direction. So I guess when you talk about persistence and a time period, when we're looking at trying to change household behavior, particularly around aspects dealing with health, what sort of time period are we talking about, particularly when we think about a one-time visit or a one-time letter, whether it's the intervention or the control group? How long? And the other aspect is, how can you separate out the effect of the intervention as compared to what else is happening around you? What I call is the other noise that's in the market.
Well, I mean, the latter question, that's why you have a control group and you keep it as a control group. But ethically, that's a hard thing to do, right? If I see a treatment effect right in the beginning and it's something in health, there's huge ethical issues with denying the control group that intervention over time. So that's a big problem. But in principle, we know how to deal with that. And it's going to add variance to the outcome over time and so make the power of your design go down over time. But that's what the control group is for. The other question is how long. That really depends on the context. I mean, if it's prenatal and postnatal healthcare uptake, it's basically after the kid is outside the window of having postnatal healthcare issues. If it's something like obesity or cancer, I mean, those are long-term periods. And the health domain has these long-term scholar-practitioner collaborations to create these great designs and then follow them over time. So, the medical profession is exploiting experiments that were done in the 50s and 60s because they did a careful job of documenting how we're going to follow up with these people. But a lot of the experiments now, we don't do that. Right? They're quick done, we do it, and there's no way of going back and exploiting those. I mean, the ones that have been exploited, as you've seen, are water, energy. Why? Because there's still the utility there collecting all the data for us. It's easy just to go knock on their door and ask for it. But when we do our own data collection, it becomes hard to do that because we don't have this network of collaborations. We hope there's administrative data or something like that. I think that needs to change if we really want to evaluate the persistent effects of some of these interventions in the context of experiments.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Thanks for your attention.
I would like to invite Professor Selvanathan for a vote of thanks.
Hi, thank you. It was very inspiring and interesting talk.
Thanks.
I was thinking while I was sitting there, I am more into alcohol and tobacco research. I was thinking, the water research and electricity, they are fine because you are sending message in one direction. But with alcohol and tobacco, the messages are going in both directions. That is, like health profession, they are sending message, it's not good.
Right.
At the same time, the industry message is, it's really good.
Right.
So I'm not sure, you don't have to answer it now, but it's interesting for me to think more about my research. It's really behavioral issue, but it's coming from two directions.
Right.
Anyhow, that's very interesting talk, and I enjoyed it, and I am sure many people have enjoyed as well. And I can see after the last night match, I thought we may not see many people here, but you can see the demand for your talk, and it's really interesting, and more people enjoyed, I think.
Thanks,
with all your tight schedule, I understand that you are moving your job to another place, and taking all the trouble and coming here. I would like to thank you for visiting us and giving this keynote address. And also, I would like to thank on behalf of the organizers and Griffith University who sponsored this talk today. Thank you.
Thanks.